Okay, so it's a little bit of an interesting story that I would like to begin with. It's with one of the Hasidic masters. His name was Reb Simcha Bunim of Pesischa, and he has some. He was very wise, and every now and then I share some of his wisdom and Torah thoughts. He has some good ones I share around the high holidays, especially. He was once walking by a riverbank, and he saw a man drowning far out in the river, and he saw this person fighting the waves and pushing and trying to stay afloat. And Reb Simcha Bunim was watching from the side, thinking of what he can do to help. When he sees, after just 60 seconds of watching, he sees the man kind of giving up, giving in. After so much effort that he's been putting in fighting those waves, he kind of was throwing in the towel and starting to sink. So Simcha Bunim, in desperation, called out, and he said something hilarious. Hold on one second. Let me just clear my throat. Okay, let's try that again. Reb Simcha Bunim yells to him, "When you get to the bottom, meaning when you get to the bottom of the water, send regards to the Leviathan." In Hebrew, the word is Leviathan. In English, I think it's pronounced Leviathan, which in the Torah, in the Psalms from King David, and elsewhere in the Torah, it talks about the fish called Leviathan that is God saved to be part of the great feast for the big banquet when Mashiach comes. It'll be attended by David and by Moses and by Avram, a big feast. What will be served, what will be on the menu, is this big fish called the Leviathan. And it says in the Talmud that the Leviathan is resting at the bottom of the sea. So Simcha Bunim yells to him, when you get to the bottom, send regards to the Leviathan. So this man was sinking, and he heard that and he started laughing. And that laugh, that joy gave him the boost, and he was able to fight, and he overcame the waves, and he was able to survive and come back to the sea, come back from the seashore. What we see from what Simcha Bunim was sharing is the reason why I yelled out something funny to him in this climactic moment of his life is because there's a need for joy. And when you experience waves and turbulence in life, the only true way to be able to overcome the challenges that arise, the waves of life that seem to try to sink us over and over again, and you overcome one wave, and there's another wave that comes. There's another challenge that wipes away and tries to overcome you. The only way to truly master it is joy. Sluggishness, melancholy, sadness, depression are things that don't allow us to really fight and be who we can really be. So I'm using that as an intro, that the first 25 chapters was talking about our battle, the ideal circumstance of how we are here, why God put us here, with a battle between the good, the godly soul, which is like the transcendental soul, the higher soul, and the animal soul, the selfish soul, the ego in our conscious that is trying to always think about what's good for us, and thinking about always thinking of just self-indulgence. And we learned about that battle. Now we're talking about more personal. That's just in general. We all have these two souls, and God gave us each the ability to overcome our struggles, our animal soul, because our godly soul by nature is in the mind that rules over the heart. And if you don't feel the meditation working to really generate those feelings, you should know that you already have that love inside that you just have to dig into and trigger, that we were learning towards the end, 18 through 25. But now it's getting more personal. What happens when there's trouble along our path, and the battle seems to be too difficult because of the feelings that we have inside of us, of sadness, of regret, of emotional apathy? when we feel apathetic to things. In Hebrew, it's called timtum halev. You ever heard of that word, Eliza? Timtum means like a clogged up heart. When we just don't care anymore. Our heart just doesn't get inspired by things. It speaks to you in the mind, but you can't generate inspiration from it. So all these things are spoken about from chapter 26, which is what we're in middle of covering, all the way through 33. It really works on overcoming these things. So last week, the question that some of you asked is the last topic that we were talking about is coping with suffering. When we go through challenges in life that seem to be so difficult to overcome, and specifically primarily in three categories that's listed out, is in Aramaic the term is bane, chaye, umezoni. In family life, dealing with either children or family struggles, with our health, and with our livelihood. Those are three things that cause us great anxiety, stress, suffering. And how do we cope with it? And in the Talmud it says we should accept it with joy. Struggles in life we should accept with joy. That's really hard to explain. How do we accept challenges and struggles and suffering with joy? So he went on to explain that there's two levels of good. There's a level of good that we could see in the world, that's manifest, that's clear to us. In the words of the Tanya, it's nira v'niglit le'nei basar. It's a good that we could see with our eyes, with our flesh eyes. But then there's a level of good that we can't appreciate. We don't see the good in it. But in truth, it is good because it's coming from God. It's just a higher level of good that is not manifest in the world as good. And our job is to say, Gam Zula Tova, this too is for the good. Do we see the good? No. But if we trust and believe that it's coming from God, there is good in there. It is good. We just don't see it. Because it's coming from a world that's hidden. We know spiritually, this is a beautiful topic that in Kabbalah is very, very well explained and elaborate. And to use the main Kabbalistic example that it brings about is when it talks about the splitting of the sea. We have the sea that was split after the Jews left Egypt. And it's known, the splitting of the sea is known as the greatest miracle of all times. The Talmud dubs it the greatest miracle. Actually, interesting, the Talmud says in that same two lines that, quote unquote, as difficult as it is for God to split the sea, because it's considered the greatest miracle, the same struggle goes through in matching people up, in making matchmaking is also something of miracles. It's something that it's hard to find the right two souls to come together and to mesh perfectly. Kasha, the words in the Talmud is matchmaking is kasha kekriyas yamsuf. And Barbara, for your husband, for Howard, who went through the whole Talmud, it's Sota, page 2a. So it's literally the first page of Tractate Sota. So it says that during the splitting of the sea, the children and adults, everyone, was able to see God. That was in a way that was never experienced before or after. The words we say every Shabbat, quoting the Torah that describes this great miracle, the words in the Torah is Zeh Eli Vanveu Elohei Avi Varo Mimenu, which means this is my God, and I will exalt him. I will extol him. The God of my fathers, and I will exalt him, I think. I think that's the current translation. But the word is Zeh. This is. Usually when you see something, you could say, this is it. The term used when we describe the splitting of the sea is the Jewish people were Zeh. They were able to see it and say, this is God. Point it with their finger and say Zeh. That's the expression. Whereas all the prophets, if you look at any Haftorah that we read on Shabbat, The words it starts with is Ko Amar Hashem. So said God. They don't have the same finger on it. They just say, so says God, meaning it's more of a vague term. While they were prophets and they had a vision of God, it was a vision where God came to them in a dream or in a parable. Whereas by the splitting of the sea, it was very direct. It was zeh. It was there. So what's explained in, that's just the basics. What's explained in Kabbalah is that the transformation that happened during the splitting of the sea was absolutely incredible. It was a spiritual manifestation of God that was unknown to the world before then. In our world, what's on land we can see. What's hidden under the sea we can't see. To explain that a little more, it says in Talmud, Kol ma sheyesh bayabasha yesh bayam, which means whatever is on dry land, it also exists in the sea. The same world we have here, there's a world. We have a Grand Canyon in Arizona. There's a Grand Canyon beneath the sea. I don't know where it is, but there's mountains under the water. The animals we have here, they're similar animals, fish that we have in the sea. Everything that we have here, we have comparative of that in the sea. The difference is one is revealed, we could see it here, and one is hidden in the water. It's covered. So what happened by the splitting of the sea is that what is usually revealed, the dry land, that's where the water split. So that became covered with the water. And what was hidden usually now became open. That was split. That's where we were walking through. So spiritually, there's a world that we can see. That's our world that we perceive, we feel, we touch, we sense, we know. Then there's a world that we don't see, the spiritual dimension. We don't see God. We don't see the value of the mitzvah. We don't see the light of Torah. We know it's there. We could feel it with our soul, but it's not as tangible, of course. What happened by the splitting of the sea, it was a total transformation. What seems normal world, that became hidden. What became the true normal during that time of splitting of the sea was spiritual. That's why we were able to point to God in the splitting of the sea and say, this is God. That became what our eyes saw. That became what we know with our flesh eyes. So spiritually, those two worlds of dry, that was part of the miracle of the splitting of the sea, that it's definitely not the holiday for that. Hanukkah is the miracle of light. Pesach is the miracle of the splitting of the sea, but it's definitely an appropriate conversation for the chapter we are in, Tanya. Because in Aramaic, these two worlds are called Amma Diskalia, the world that is revealed, manifest, the regular world, the way we know it. And then there's Amma Diskasia, the hidden world. The world that we don't see, and it's covered. It's a covered over world. What we're saying here in Tanya is that there is good the way it comes into the manifest world, meaning we could appreciate and see it and see the good. But then there's a good that remains in the covered world, and I think the word we used was e-manifest world. I think that was the word we used somewhere. E-manifest. That was, I think, the English we got.
I think it was unmanifest.
Oh, unmanifest? Okay, thank you.
I think so.
All right. Either one. It's the one that's not manifested. And the good that comes directly from that covered world, we don't see the good, but we should trust that it is good. So when what we feel as suffering, as struggles and challenges, you should know that it just means that it's coming from the higher dimension, the concealed world. In terms of God's name, God has 7 holy names. The Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, which is known in English, I have no idea what it even means, but God's Tetragrammaton, it's God's holy essential name. It's a Yud, a Hey, a Vav, and Hey. We don't pronounce that name. We only pronounce it as we do Ado, like Baruch Atah Ado, but that's not how it's spelled. It's spelled with a Yud, a Hey, Vav, and a Hey. That, and the way we do pronounce it is not the correct vowels, but we pronounce it as Havaya. But that's not the true name of God. We don't pronounce it. It says only the Kohen in the temple, he would pronounce this name of God, but since then we don't pronounce the name of God. It says actually when the Kohen would pronounce God's name, we would fall to the ground. It was overwhelming spiritual experience. So God has 4 letters in this holy name, the Yud and the Hey, the Vav and the Hey. The Yud and the Hey are the first 2 letters of the name. Those are considered to be God, the way he's before the manifestation of God's glory, before the manifestations of God's light. The Yud is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It's just like a dot in the Torah. It's just the seed of God's light. It's before it's able to be coming down into the world. Now that seed from the Yud of God's infinite light, it comes to the Hey. The Hey is a broader letter. It's expansive, vertically and horizontally. It goes that way and that way. It's the way God's light is being expanded, but still in the concealed worlds. It's still the infinite light that is getting more of a form. But then the Vav, which is the 3rd letter of God's name, the Vav is a line from up to down. It's drawing down God's light from the concealed worlds to more of a finite place, to more of a revealed world. It's something that we don't see God's name, but we could connect with God in more of a emotional and spiritual dimension. And then it goes into the last Hey, which is again expanding that God's light, the way it's flowing into the world, to be coming into the world. So there's a verse that says, fortunate is the person that who you, God, admonish. Lucky is the person whom you, O God, admonish. Seems like a tough verse. It's like tough love going on there. But really the wording that is used to the name of God that is used over there is only the Yud and the Hey, not the full name of God, the Yud and the Hey. Fortunate is the person that the Yud Hey, the God, the way it's the first 2 letters of God's holy name, admonishes. Because the admonishment that's coming from this world, from this level of God's name, is from the concealed world. And on that, it's fortunate. Because if you're receiving the good that bypasses this world, is coming directly from on high, it may not seem like good, but know that it is. And therefore, the Talmud says, like you bless God on the good, you also have to bless God on the bad. When, God forbid, if someone passes in a family, there still is a blessing that the mourners say at the funeral. So that's just a little bit of what we've been discussing. And the question we had and Barbara, I have to tell you, I spent some time researching it, and I'm in the middle of a pretty long section of studying it. My mentor directed me to read certain books and to listen to a certain talk on it. So it's a Yiddish talk, so I'm getting through it. And I didn't finish it yet. So I want to give you full service in answering your question. But the question that Barbara asked is, what type of struggles and suffering are we talking about? When someone is deathly sick, are they supposed to be praising God? Is the family supposed to say, thank you, God? When there's a pandemic in the world and people are going through a crisis, is that the suffering that we're talking about? And I told you, I'm pretty sure that is part of it, but it's such a sensitive topic. I want to make sure that I'm not just answering it without doing proper justice. So I don't have a full answer, but I need a little more time. Is that okay, Barbara? Any questions, Lisa? Does that make sense? Okay.
I just think that everything that God does is for a reason.
Right.
Everything. It's just like you say, it's beyond our comprehension.
Yeah.
Everything that God does is for our benefit.
Yeah. So Lisa's saying that if we trust in God, everything that God does is for our best. It's for our benefit. And that's absolutely true. And that's faith in God 101, right? That's trust. You put your trust in God. If there's a God in the world, everything God does is really for your best. And that's really going to be the foundation of chapter 26. It's hard to swallow. And I've been trying to research, going through specific examples of suffering. Some people are stronger and they have that ingrained, and they just, no matter what comes their way, they just push through. But even to say, wow, God, thank you, that's a whole new level. Not only to say, I'm sure there's there's a blessing in this, is to say, God, I feel like the most lucky person. And some people have it. Elisa, you're one of them that have this incredible strength. But to explain that, and what's cool about the Tanya is this is a guide for everyone. So the goal of chapter 26 is to make that attainable and make that palatable for all of us. And I just wanted, but you're right, that is the correct perspective. And I'm just trying to get the right words. So what we're going to do, if okay with you, we're just going to go back to 301 and explain and just go through a Hasidic thought on it, which, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't do, and because I skipped right over it. So if you're looking on the Kindle, which I'm about to pull up on these, you know what? If you're following along, or just listen and tune in, open your heart. The manifest world is plagued with polarity. North only exists because of south, light because of dark, sweetness because of bitterness, and pleasure because of pain. Did we read this, or did I just read this on my own? I don't remember. You might like the idea of a life which is totally devoid of pain and only offers pleasure, but that's actually impossible because in the manifest world, the two experiences are interrelated. That's so cool. There's a polarity. So if you have pleasure, there's also pain in the same world. If there's north, there's also south. They are two ends of the same pole. If there was no pain, there would be no pleasure. In the unmanifest world, there is only reality, essence, or you might simply call it being. It's just God himself before he manifested the dualities that we are familiar with. When you shift your consciousness to be aligned with the unmanifest world, your priority is not whether you are feeling pain or pleasure. What matters is that you are experiencing God. Pain may be unpleasant, but ultimately, it is also an expression of God. So are you experiencing God? Yes. It may be an unpleasant one, but it's an expression of God. So if you're able to shift into that unmanifest world, it's amazing. The shift in consciousness necessary to align yourself with the unmanifest world would be impossible if you didn't have Chachma in your soul. Chachma, which we're learning about in chapter 18, 19, and 20, Chachma is that the essence of our soul, the highest part of our soul, and from there it flows into the rest of our consciousness and being. That experience of God in an unmanifest place, space, is coming from the Chachma of our soul. In this case, it enables you to look beyond your personal preference for pleasure over pain and focus on the transpersonal reality of being connected with the unmanifest world. That's far more precious than anything the manifest world has to offer. I'm going to pull it out. Actually, I don't. They don't have this in the screen, but you should screenshot this or take a picture of it and just think about this to digest these words. Manifest world means polarity. Polarity means if there's pleasure, there's also pain. If there's pain, there's also pleasure. If you're able to tap into the unmanifest world, this concealed world, it's God in his essence. When you're experiencing God in his essence, it's beyond the polarity. There's no opposite ends because there's just the being. There's just God. And that's the two letters of God's name, the first two letters of God's name. It's an expression of God that you're in touch with. How do you get in touch with this? From your soul that you already have, meaning you don't have to do anything extra to be able to experience it. It's already in your soul. It's called Chachma. You have it and I have it. We just have to tap into it. That's what Tanya is about. Tapping into that Chachma. Realizing that everything in the world is an expression of God. And therefore, even a place of sadness that you feel in, or let me rephrase that, even a struggle and suffering that you feel in life, tap into the Chachma of your soul, and you will actually see it as a gift from God. And therefore, fortunate is the person who God admonishes. God meaning the first two letters of God's name from this concealed, unmanifest world. Cool. Thank you. That was good. Any questions? Good? I found this to be very powerful. Awesome. Okay, so now we'll continue on 302 if you're looking inside, and I'll just share my screen now. That was lovely. Here we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. Let me make it a little bigger. I'll just, third paragraph on 302 from the top, or if you're looking in the Kindle, we're on the bottom paragraph. And this is the meaning of the verse, fortunate is the man whom you, O God, admonish. Where God's name in the verse is spelled Yud He, signifying the unmanifest, the world that is not manifest. When you experience pleasure, it can be harder to connect to God because your own enjoyment draws you away from God consciousness. Pain and admonishment, on the other hand, force you to shift your consciousness towards the unmanifest and to forget about yourself. And that is a fortunate predicament. This is so cool that this is in the Tanya, meaning 220 years ago, this is already a teaching to see the difference in your God consciousness, that your own pleasure could pull you away from that because there's you involved. But when you experience admonishment, you could direct yourself to that unmanifest. Amazing. Easy to learn and to read, a whole nother world to implement and experience. We have a lot that we still have to learn on this. Therefore, our sages of blessed memory taught, like those who love him are like the sun going out in its strength. Refers to those who happily accept suffering. Just to quote the verse, this is a verse from Judges. It says, I just want to read the words in Hebrew. Hasmeichim b'yisurim, those who rejoice in suffering. The word in the Torah says, ve'ohavav, meaning those who love God, those who love him, kitzeit hashemesh bigvurato, like the sun going out in its strength. I'm curious to know further if he learns that parallel of the strength of the sun going out. I don't know much about that. Let's see. This verse in Judges cited by the Talmud is, at first glance, elusive. What does happily accept suffering have to do with the sun going out in its strength? Oh, cool. So he's gonna study it. And how is it connected with the experience of love? Those who love him. So he answers like this, because this happy acceptance of suffering comes from a love of closeness to God that surpasses anything in this world. As the verse states, for experiencing your kindness is better than worldly life. And in the Hebrew, that's from David. And David is a person that had struggles and suffering throughout his entire life. And he says, Kitov chastecha, your kindness is better, mechayim, from life. Life he's referring to as worldly life. And your kindness is better than worldly pleasures, worldly life. So, and if closeness with God is what matters to you, then it is to be found with more dignity and to an immeasurably greater extent in the unmanifest world. So if what you're looking for is what's best, what feels good to you, then you're looking in the manifest world. But if you're looking into connecting with God in the deepest and most intimate way possible, then to experience that kindness, it's in a immeasurable way in the unmanifest world. So I don't think he answered the question yet. The question we have from the verse is from Judges, that the verse says that those who love Hashem are like the sun going out in its strength. And the Talmud says, who is that referring to? What does it mean to love God? That you accept suffering happily. So we're trying to understand how the Talmud learns that out. And what does it have to do with the sun going out in its strength? So what we've studied in this little section here is that if a person is experiencing suffering and they accept it with love and they feel the closeness of God in there, Like David says, your kindness is better than any worldly life. At that point, you feel the connection with God in an immeasurable way when it's coming from this unmanifest world, from this hidden world. The unmanifest precedes the manifest and transcends it. If you want to be closer to God, then you would prefer a connection with the unmanifest, even if it is painful. What comes to mind, just in the Torah portions that we've been reading, and last week we have the big battle and the confrontation between Yaakov and Esav. And it says that Esav, after they made peace, Esav basically left the land of Israel. He moved out. It says they weren't able to both dwell in the land. So Esav said, I'm gonna get out. Now, the Rebbe asked a great question. The Rebbe says, Esav was never known as such a kind-hearted person. And all of a sudden he's like, oh, Yaakov, you stay, I'll be the one to leave. What's going on over here? It doesn't seem Esav-like. So Esav actually was a smart man. And he knew from his grandfather, their great-grandfather, no, Esav, his grandfather, Avram. Esav's knew that there was a promise given to Avram, to his grandfather. The promise was that the land of Israel will be to you and your children. But first, in the parasha of Lech Lecha, God says you have to be servants in a land that is not yours. You'll be enslaved in a land for 400 years, right? Referring to Egypt. So Avram accepted. He said, "Fine, we'll go through the suffering, and then we'll get the land of Israel." Esav knew that whichever child, whichever lineage of Avram will be the one to accept the suffering, will be the one to experience and receive the land of Israel. But he says, I don't want that suffering. I don't want it. So he left before the suffering was going to begin, basically saying, I'm giving it over to Yaakov's line. That's how the Rebbe understands it from Rashi in the Torah. But there was an extreme suffering that the Jews had to go through. We celebrate every year Passover, the Exodus, in order to receive that closeness with God that we received, that we experience after, with the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah, and eventually the land of Israel. That's just an example. If someone were to be in a relationship, but they were able to be given a 30-year vision of what their marriage is going to look like to this person, and during that time, they see love and harmony, and they see hardships and illness. In the ketubah and in civil marriages, they say until in health and in what's the second word, Eliza? In health and in illness, health and in sickness, something like that. Until death do us part or something. But if a person, people say it, but is a person really ready to go through life if they know there's going to be health challenges in their spouse along the way? If someone was able to be given a mirror and see 30 years ahead, how many will actually choose it? So I guess what I'm trying to get to is if someone knew that they would have extreme health challenges and struggles in their relationship, but the love and the oneness and the harmony, the peace that they have is so beautiful and so real and so authentic that they say, I want it. Give me that suffering. I'll take it because of the incredible love that is and the oneness that we have. So over here, if a person what a person cares for is that closeness with God, they would say, God, the struggles and the suffering that I feel is just a closer way of connecting with you. It's coming from this unmanifest world. I don't know if he's going to get to any of that. That's what's coming off the cuff over here. But what we see is the unmanifest world is transcending and precedes the manifest world. If your goal is to be closer to God, and that's what you care, you would actually prefer a connection with the unmanifest world, even if it comes with pain and suffering. Wow. Let me just read some questions here. Sorry for the delay. Oh, Adrian, good question. Why dignity? He actually puts that in quotes. I was thinking the same thing, Adrian. Let me just go back that page and see if it's towards the bottom. You see with more dignity, right? The quote is from, I'm just looking at the Hebrew, the words in Hebrew, and Elisa, tell me if you heard of these words. Yeser or yeter se'et. It's on, if you want to see the Hebrew, it's towards the bottom of 302. Yeser se'et is actually what Jacob, our patriarch, on his deathbed gave his firstborn son a blessing, that your strength will be with more dignity. I don't know what that means in this context. If you want that closeness to be with more dignity. Good question, Adrian. Thank you for bringing that up. I don't know. I was thinking the same thing, but I just read it. It's good to ponder it. So Chachma is more divine, and Bina and Das, more of this manifest world. Yeah, Bina, I got it. So is Chachma more divine? Yes. Chachma is the closest of the infinite light that we get. Just to explain in the realm of spiritual Hishtalshalut, which is the chain of God's spiritual energy and flow coming to the world, the way God manifests first into the world is through Chachma. Chachma is the initial seed of inquiry, of wisdom. It's that humbleness. And that's actually the channel for God's infinite light. So everything else is more finite as it's coming down. Chachma is the top of it. And actually just think in how Hashem made us, right? The head is at the top of our body. That's how Hashem made it, because it's the top. And also within our mind, the first part of our thinking capacity, of our cognitive faculty, is the power of Chachma. That's the inquiry to start thinking, the idea that arises. So that's Chachma. That's spiritually, it's the highest level, light of God that's coming into the world. It's God's infinite light getting some form, and that's called Chachma. What if you don't embrace all suffering? Does that mean you don't love God? That's a good question. You are seen as not loving Hashem. No, not at all, because it's a hard thing, and we're supposed to not only serve God on blind faith. You're supposed to serve God through our heart, like we say, "V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha." We shall love God with our heart, with all our hearts. And actually, the Talmud says the word could have read in grammatical Hebrew. It could have said "b'chol libcha." Lev is a heart. Your heart would be libcha. Cha then makes it yours, your heart. But it says levavcha. It actually puts two vets in there. Like it's a levav instead of a lev. So the Talmud right away say, what does it mean b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, with a more a bigger word in there? It says b'shnei yitzarecha. You should love God with both of your inclinations, your godly, transcendent God soul, and with your animal, egoic, and more selfish soul. So the point is to embrace God with both. It's certainly not easy, and you shouldn't be just relying on blind faith. That's why we're learning Tanya to get to it. But it's actually a beautiful point, Shira. Someone who's opening Tanya is someone that's already in a relationship with God and loves God, but is working to always better themselves. So that's part of questioning God is part of it, and then realizing where this love from God is coming from, and coming from a higher place, is not necessarily an answer to our questions, but it's an appreciation of not even having a question anymore. So you are loving God. There's just a deeper form of love, and a higher form. And it's an amazing coping skill to have, to realize that it's actually coming from a place of love. And if you could really tap into that, you're more joyful. So it's but you have love even without it. Let's see. Oh, cool. That's so cool, Robin. If anyone's looking at the chat and you don't have the book in front of you, you could open that thing. I'm assuming it's not a virus, Robin, and you could actually read the Hasidic thought. Oh, you
virus and bacteria free.
Oh, you just took a picture of it and posted it. That's so cool.
That's all I did. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I should hire you for my Sunday technology, because it looks like you know what you're doing. So
You do.
you have to accept it all, but you don't have to like it. That's so So I think what Tanya is trying to get to is to feel fortunate in what you're feeling, to be joyful in that experience. Meaning, I think that's actually going to be the main point of the chapter, is to not just see suffering and accept it, because you could still accept it, but accept it begrudgingly, accept it with sadness. The point is that sadness is a horrible thing when it comes to our service of God. You can't win the battle with your animal soul in a place of sadness or sluggishness. Like the example we gave a couple weeks ago was the wrestler, that even if he's more trained and stronger, he would lose if he's not having a good day. So the point is to find joy in it. Not easy, but I think that's going to be part of the point. I'm understanding. But we'll continue studying together. This is a lot of good stuff going on. Okay, we're towards the bottom of the screen. Actually, sorry, we're on the next page, so I will turn it there. For in the unmanifest world, there his strength is hidden. It's a quote from the prophet Habakkuk. There's not too many people named after him. I never heard of that name, Habakkuk. And he sits in secrecy on high. His presence is more powerful, which is actually just a cool thing. Some of you are familiar. The Hebrew of this word from Psalms is Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon. Is anyone familiar with that psalm and where it's famously said? We actually open a funeral service with this verse, chapter 91. Some of you are familiar with the rabbi and the pallbearers, people that are holding or carrying the coffin. They stop 7 times on the way to the final resting place, on the way to the grave. Those 7 times is a verse in this chapter of Psalms 91 that has 7 words in it, and it's talking about the angels accompanying the person. But the beginning of that verse, which means the first words we say at a funeral, that when the coffin is being brought, is Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon, which means God who sits in secrecy on high. And this secrecy, that's the unmanifest world, and that's the high, that's the most powerful. It's amazing what Chassidus is, Chassidus, where it takes a verse and it's explaining to you what to learn from the verse, like on a deeper meaning. And now, just going back to the previous verse from the previous page, about what is the sun, the strength of the sun going out, what does it have to do with the joy and suffering? So that's, I think, what he's going to answer now. So that is why, through happily accepting suffering, you will merit to experience in the future the sun going out in its strength, which refers to the sun emerging from its protective filter, which screens the sun in this world. Whereas in the future, the sun will appear out of its filter. So global warming, according to this, is a sign of Mashiach coming. I'm kidding. That wasn't. I'm not taking political sides here. There's nothing to do with that. I'm just saying what it's saying here is nowadays, I think it's called the ozone layer, shielding us from the sun, is the greatest kindness that we have. Because if the sun didn't have that layer of protective shield, we would have been burnt. If we were any closer to the sun, we would be burnt. We wouldn't be able to handle it. But when Mashiach comes, we would be able to directly receive from the sun and not be burnt. We will actually be able to enjoy it. Spiritually, we're not just talking about a sun and a world. Spiritually, the heat of the sun is referring to the glow and the light of God, that powerful light that nowadays we can't handle. It's too overwhelming. But when Mashiach comes, we will be able to receive from that sun, meaning from that unmanifest world. That's the sun in its strength. So now we have the sun not in its strength, right? We have the sun that gives its light, and we appreciate it, but it's to a certain degree of distance, and we need that, and a protective shield. When Mashiach comes, we'll be able to receive directly from the sun. It means directly from the unmanifest world, without a filter, without any protection, and yet we will be able to receive it. So just if I'm understanding, and anyone correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, we won't appreciate that. That's a reward for accepting suffering happily. If we now have the right attitude, when, God forbid, we are accepting suffering, when we are experiencing suffering, the merit will be that when Mashiach comes, we'll be able to experience that unmanifest light of God from that world without any protective shield. If anyone's reading that differently, you could let me know. That's how I'm learning it. As the Talmud states, in the world that is coming, it's called Olam Haba in Hebrew, there will be no purgatory. Rather, the Blessed One will bring the sun out of its filter, and through it, the righteous will be healed, and the wicked will be judged, punished. So, actually, we also say this in a funeral. I don't know why I'm talking about funerals so much. We shouldn't be delving on it. But it says, Bila hamaves lanetzach, death and impurity will be abolished from the world, which means people that their whole life is hate, terrorism, and all that crazy stuff. They won't be able to live in the world to come because there'll be such a glowing light of God that they will simply melt in front of it. Because that filter will be, nowadays we have a filter. When you have a filter, everyone's able to take it. But when the filter is removed, that sun is shining strong from that unmanifest world when Mashiach comes, and therefore the wicked will be judged by it. They won't be able to live in it. The righteous will be healed. It actually says a sliver of this we saw in last week's Torah portion with Yaakov battling the famous story. There's a famous painting of it, of Yaakov battling with the angel of Esav. And he got injured. Until this day, we don't eat from the sciatica nerve, from the dislocation of Yaakov's hip joint. And how did he heal? How did he heal? It says the sun came out stronger than usual, and actually it also came out earlier. And that healed the sun power. So nowadays we're using solar energy, but back then it was already known that healed Yaakov, the power of the sun. And that's going to be when Mashiach comes. It's going to heal the righteous, and it's going to judge the wicked. In other words, and by the way, just nothing to do with Tanya, but it's just a cool thing. There's little hints to Torah. And Barbara, tell me if you talked about this last week at your Shabbos table, where you see the sun rising earlier than usual, or the sun setting later than usual. There's a famous story with Joshua. Tell me if anyone knows of this story. Yeshua, he was at battle with enemies in Israel, and it says on the 3rd of Tammuz, which is in the early summer, Shemesh beGivon Dom. The sun stopped in Givon. Joshua needed the Jews to be victorious, of course, and we needed the sun to be out. It had to do with astrology, and the sun was on the Jew side and the moon not. So we needed the sun out. And Joshua kept the sun in its place for the Jews to be victorious. Anyway, just back to this point over here, Yaakov, the sun rose earlier than usual so it could heal him as he was about to confront Esav. But a few years prior, the sun set earlier than usual. It says when he was running away from Esav 22 years prior to this, he was leaving Israel, and God wanted him to rest in Israel for one last night, and that's where the famous dream with the ladder and the angels going up and down the ladder. So it says the sun set. So the commentators learn it set. What does it mean the sun set? It set earlier than usual, because God wanted him to sleep there that night. So once it got dark, he had to camp out. So I guess for those 20 years, the sun was a little off in its hours because it set earlier than usual, so it kept up that rhythm. But now it went back to its regular rhythm when it rose earlier than usual. I don't know if anyway, the commentaries use that as an expression. We'll stop in the study for now. We'll just answer some questions. You have to accept it versus embrace it. There's a difference between accept and embrace. Yeah, exactly. And over here, I think it's talking about embracing it and feeling the joy in it. And then we could experience that sun when Mashiach comes from that unmanifest world. Finding joy in is probably, so Maddie, that's awesome. Thank you. Adrian, Maddie's answering your question. Dignity is referring to doing it with joy, finding joy in it. That's like the dignity we're referring to. Okay, cool. And when you say Mizmor Shir Liyom Shabbat, is that referring to the Psalm of 91? Yoshe B'Seiter Elyon? What do you mean, Barbara?
Yes, exactly. The quote that you said is from that prayer, if I'm not mistaken.
So let's just go back inside for a second, because maybe there was a few quotes. One of them is from chapter 92. Yoshe B'Seiter Elyon is from 91. Mizmor Shir is what number is that? I think it's 92, I guess. Do you know if you're referring to this one? He sits in secrecy on high, or you're referring to the one before? I think you're curious to know which one you're referring to. I think it's a different one, but I may be wrong. Okay, thank you. Okay, awesome. Great stuff. This was a beautiful class. Thank you all so much for joining.